Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
I'm Elijah Fleming.
And I'm Christy Vogler.
And today we're talking about 300, 2006 American historical action film directed by Zack Snyder and based on the 1998 graphic novel of the same name by Frank Miller. Now, we've talked about this movie before, way back in the early days of the show when it was just Eli and I and much, much shoddier equipment. But this is the first of several episodes that we're actually in the process of updating. So some of the bigger movies we've covered, we're going back to with a little time between us, a little more retrospection, a little more experience under our belts, and new guests. And one of these new guests is here with us today. You may recognize him from his YouTube videos with Insider, where he discusses ancient battles. So joining us today is Dr. Roel Konijnendijk, a Darby Fellow in Ancient History at Lincoln College at the University of Oxford. So welcome, Roel. Glad to have you on the show.
Glad to be here. Thanks very much for having me.
So we usually start with our guests, and we'll start with you. So one, what is your experience with the film 300? We know you've talked about it at length, even today. And yeah, do you dig this movie?
Yeah, this movie actually came out when I was a teenager. So I went to see it in cinemas. Actually, I think it's the first movie I saw in IMAX. So I saw it in cinema twice, which clearly kind of shows that I was the target audience at the time. Like I was an undergrad. I was like really happy to watch these kinds of movies, but also just kind of really digging the idea of a movie about this kind of topic, which I was already getting interested in as a sort of area that I was trying to move into maybe for my studies. And then also just thinking there is no movie like this, both in the sense of the topic, like there is no movie about classical Greek warfare at all, but also there's no movie that is anything like this, which at the time I thought was amazing. You know, I was really just kind of discovering my own taste in movies as well. And I was trying to think of, you know, what kind of things do I actually like? What kind of things inspire me or get me excited? And one of the things that 300 really does is this hyper stylized stuff, right? Which I thought was just really cool. And I was at the time thinking like, this is just, you know, I love it when they do this in a movie, when they don't try to be kind of dry and boring, like a lot of the movies that I saw when I was even younger, that they are trying really to go all in on a particular way of depicting something, even when it's not realistic, even when it's not necessarily grounded or anything. It's just like, it wants to be a particular thing. It wants to be unique that way. I really enjoyed that. I really loved that. So it's definitely one of the things that inspired me to go further into this research area, actually, to try and learn more about Greek history and Greek warfare, and about the Persians. Not really like the primary mover or anything, but it's just one of those things that contributed to it because there was a lot of things going on at the time. Like this is only a few years after Troy and Alexander came out. So it's kind of a whole like period in which this kind of thing was, you know, in cinema a lot, and then you could go see them, and that's amazing. And it's just like this one really stands out for just how stylized and extreme it is. I've cooled on it over time. I'm sure we'll get into this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I do remember even at the time that I was already thinking, like, obviously because I was already a history student, that I was already quite critical of the way that it depicted certain things, certain aspects of the story. I was already kind of like, this isn't really how I would do it necessarily, but because it's so stylized, because it's so extreme, because it's so like, you know, gung-ho and like over the top of the action, you're kind of forgiving it for a lot of things because you're like, wow, it just looks really cool. But again, over time, it's sort of that opinion has shaken somewhat, started to wobble a little bit.
I think many of us can kind of relate with that sort of narrative arc. Shifting to Christy, because I think you're the sort of freshest on. Yeah, what's your experience, and do you dig this film?
I definitely dug it at the time it came out. I'm really similar to Roel in a lot of ways. This would have come out just as I was graduating from high school, going to college. And I'd already actually been taking college level courses. And I had this great professor at the local community college, Professor Walker, who would come into class every day and he'd write out his entire lecture in chalk on the chalkboard for like the first 10 minutes of class. And then he'd turn around and just tell it like a story. And he was a big military person too. And so I remember learning the story of Thermopylae from this professor. And it was also like the first history teacher I had that hadn't been a varsity sports coach of some kind in a long time. So kudos to him. It was a really fun class. And I remember that I had learned about the Battle of Thermopylae and all of a sudden got to see this movie about it. And then a few years later, I got to study abroad in Greece, and one of our trips was to Thermopylae. So I have a picture of me making a pose at the hill where they have the dedication. So like it was such a huge touchstone film for me in like getting into reception and ancient history and things like that. Greek mythology was my first love, and this was the first film that wasn't Greek mythology, but was still really cool in some respects. I think that with Gladiator and Troy was kind of my holy trinity introduction into all of this. And then, I watched it quite a few times. I took a Sword and Sound film class while I was an undergraduate. I watched it with friends. So, I watched it a ton in the early 2000s. And then I haven't since today. And I watched it today. And after Spartacus, too, where, you've seen the aesthetic. And I will say this looks visually stunning. It has aged well in that regard. But there's no real substance below that. And I was starting to find it incredibly boring because of that. So definitely have lost a lot of love for the film over time, but it's still really important to me in terms of what sparked a lot of my interest into ancient history going forward.
Yeah. I feel like Colin and I were very much the same in that so much of military history and battles and armor and weapons was kind of what got us interested just in the ancient world in general. I know that was very much for me. As a high school student, I did this Saturday class on military blunders in history, in which I was the only girl. And another guy in that class was the man who became my future husband. But I think that kind of exciting, super dramatic, violent topic, it has such a hook just in pop culture in general. And so I think I definitely remember watching it with friends as a younger person and being like, this is weird. This is cool. And I think the people in our theater troupe in high school would yell at each other what is your profession, and scream down the hallways. That was such a big thing. And
because it is such an iconic movie, right? It's become such a moment. I mean, at the time it was just meme-tastic, but also since then it's had such an influence. But on the other hand, I mean, you're saying now when you watch it now it feels kind of boring because it doesn't have that substance. When we were watching it earlier in preparation for this, we kind of just thinking you could never make this movie now, and not even in terms of the style. I mean, you might, you can picture a movie that is sort of quite so focused on style over substance and has such a focus on violent action. That's obviously constantly happening, but the tone of it, it's not, because it doesn't have no substance. It has a really noxious substance. It is really for those groups that you were studying with, right? These little boys who are really into military history and weapons and stuff. That is who it's for. And that's a group that had a lot of cultural presence at the time. But thankfully, that's really receded. And so nowadays you wouldn't imagine making a movie that is so overwhelmingly, overbearingly male in its interest and its gaze and its tone and its its whole ideology. It's just this sort of, now it feels like this really stale and really quite pathetic masculinity that is just oozing out of everything that it is. I just it's not of this time. The effects, the visuals, the cinematography, it's beautiful. There are many shots in this movie that I would genuinely say you could frame that and hang it on your wall, because Zack Snyder knows how to make a pretty movie.
Yes.
But what is going on with this movie's whole value system? It's so awful.
I was looking back, and when Eli and I first talked about this movie, it was September 2020. So we were still months out from January 6th, where you have basically people cosplay, you talk about sort of fragile masculinity really latching onto this movie. That's it right there. You got people cosplaying as, Spartans, or this sort of this image or this rendering of ancient Sparta, which I'm sure we'll get into as well, about the sort of fantasy that's going on there.
I do feel entertained by this movie in so many ways. And I think some of that is, we talk about nostalgia glasses sometimes, right? And I also was horrified to learn that, this movie is 18 years old, which is insane.
It's for our students now, it's about as old as them. And for many of them, they hadn't, I talked to students today, and we mentioned the cultural impact that was inescapable, right? There's parodies, people were saying lines from the films everywhere you went, memed out the wazoo. And I'm curious, did it just drop out of the zeitgeist?
Yeah. My myth students have not seen Troy. They haven't seen 300. They haven't seen Gladiator. And they've seen Percy Jackson.
Yeah.
I mean, that's probably fine. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, it's not the worst.
It's just, Yeah, it was such a sort of random hit as well, because I remember when it was in production, like I was watching it somehow. I found out that it was going to be made right on IMDb before it had any kind of publicity material, just a title and some people attached. But it's like, it's Zack Snyder's second movie. He was a nobody. Nobody attached to it is particularly famous. I mean, when they started out, like some of those people were names you'd seen before, others are completely unknown. And then you're just thinking, like, I don't know if this is going to be anything. And then it turns out when the trailer comes out, it's like, oh, this is like really like different, right?
Yeah.
This is not just a movie about a battle. This is its own thing. And you can kind of see that going two ways. Like when Tarsem did Immortals. I don't know if you guys ever did you do an episode on that? I don't know.
We remember Immortals.
Like right. I mean, Tarsem is a genius. Like I think he's one of the most competent directors out there. But also when he tried to do something like this kind of like devoid of context, devoid of environment, just these really stark sets that are really based on like, it's this visual digital environment, it didn't work. Like nobody really took it up. Like, nobody really understood what he was trying to do with that.
Yeah, it has like a surrealist kind of aesthetic to it, right? It seems like it's almost like a landscape from like a Dali painting or something.
Right. And so like he has this whole, it's clearly what he wants to do, right? This isn't a mistake. It's just that nobody really connected with it anyway. And so you kind of could have seen 300 going the same way. Just sort of disappearing as a sort of weird little cult movie by some like up and coming director. And you just kind of go like, yeah, well, this is, that came and went. But instead, it's like this massive cultural event. Like it's one of the most iconic movies of the early 2000s. It's like up there with Lord of the Rings, They're just like, in terms of how recognizable it is, in terms of how much people just visualize pre-modern history now according to its sort of image of it. It's more iconic than Troy, which is like, what? Like, Troy did so much more work to try and make that world feel real, llamas and all.
Yes, right?
Weird tie-dyed. But it did so much work to try and make that feel like a tactile environment, and it's just not as iconic. It's just not.
It was kind of in some ways like if Gladiator is the sort of the rebirth of the golden era Sword and Sandal, like it's kind of the second rebirth and one that goes in like a very different sort of direction. Like you said, like away from being grounded, it's more rooted in comic books and superheroes and things like that. And really like maybe like the sort of stepping stone, Gladiator 1 is maybe the movie that made this movie possible because the studio almost didn't do it. Warner Brothers, I think, almost didn't do it because Troy had just come out and was sort of, okay. It wasn't the runaway hit that Gladiator was, but Sin City had just come out. Robert Rodriguez did Sin City, another Frank Miller graphic novel, and then that kind of stylized comic book. That combined with Zack Snyder's pitch, and I think he did like a test screening or sort of shot a couple scenes. And the visual distinctiveness was what gave this movie the kind of green light. And then, yeah, like you said, kind of it blew up. And then I was just remarking like the ways like I detect sort of its fingerprints, still today in all sorts of places. Like there's sort of obvious ones, like we were just talking about Spartacus, and particularly that first season and that first scene is very copycatting 300, but even just stuff like if you play the Assassin's Creed Odyssey game, you kick people off cliffs doing that kind of, it's called a Spartan kick. I was in the most recent Civilization game, one of the sort of faction leaders for the Greece rather is Gorgo. And I was sort of thinking to myself, like, would Gorgo have made it into this game without this movie? Would anybody know who Gorgo is?
Yeah, there's Gorgo skirmishers as well in Rome 2 Total War, right? Like that's what? But no, I mean, I think this is right. Like it's Sin City, right? Like if you want to understand this movie, it's you don't look at Troy, you look at Sin City. Like that's where it came from. That's the whole idea. It's basically that and Hero.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's those two movies like had a
jelly one
baby and it's 300.
Yeah. I feel like the gritty historical is kind of like where it kicked off, but it also fed into the superhero genre too, because I'm thinking of like Batman's Dark Knight and things like that. Yeah. So it's like it didn't necessarily continue a huge trend in like the kind of historical films that were being made at the time, but it definitely was going into some of these other genres that became really big in the 2010s. So yeah. I was also thinking it was really interesting. Like, I wonder if there might be certain subsets of populations we know really gravitate towards this film that are problematic. And I was, listening to some of the rhetoric in it. It's like they're portraying politicians as really poor. And then they're talking about like the few that are righteous stand up to the tyranny of all of this. It's like that's going to speak to populations, but where it might not pick up is the fact that it's also hard against like religion, right? Like the ephors and the oracle and things like that. It's like, well, that's not going to work in an ethno-Christian United States right now. So,
well, I kind of disagree because like there's so many things that even like fly in the face of classic Christianity that are going on in our politics, right? And so many even fundamentalist Christians are kind of just turning a blind eye, like, yeah, it's fine as long as our social issues get pushed forward. It's fine. It's fine.
It's also like explicitly against what they call like mysticism, right? Like, it's not. So you could say like, we need to progress towards Christianity. We need to reject this old like paganism. Like it fits within the Christian worldview, I think.
Yeah.
But of course, more than that, it just fits into this idea because I think I see the whole movie as a study in masculinity, right? That's what it is.
Oh, sure.
It's just depicting an idea of what it means to be a man. Like that's the whole thing. That's what it's about. Because it has no character arc or anything. It just has a man doing man stuff. And one of those things, obviously, is that he must be rational and secular, right? Because that's the modern man. Like he is somebody who is above superstition and irrational distractions. And so in that sense, it has to be that way, even though its depiction of both the Ephoret and Greek religion is completely like off the charts, insane, ridiculous. Like there is no connection between this and anything that we actually know.
No, every time I watch that scene, I'm like, what?
What
happened here?
What's interesting too is like when they're referring to magicians or mysticism, it's the scene they're showing during the battle is like they have little gunpowder bombs that they're just throwing, or like sparkler bombs. I don't know what else to call it, but it's like one could argue that's actually science right there. And I was like, I don't believe in that stuff. And I'm like, okay, maybe this will speak to the certain subset I'm thinking it's going to speak to.
I don't believe hand grenades aren't real.
Yeah. I'm thinking of when he's like first kind of contemplating like what to do after the Ephors say no. He's like talking to Gorgo and she says, you can't think about what a Spartan does, but what would a free man do? And so I think that makes so much sense in this like study of masculinity. It's like, no, it's not your identity as a Spartan. It's your identity as a free man.
As a stigma male. No, that's it, right? He's supposed to, like everything he does. And then of course they bang because he has to also be like a really competent lover. Like
exactly.
Goes without saying. I mean, it's so much that, like, it's so much of it is so like unapologetically and kind of almost unashamedly, like it's so honest about what it's trying to do. It's just like, this is what I think a man should be. This is how I'm going to put it, and that's all you get.
And the irony, well, I mean, and even something that Zack Snyder himself has commented on is that the thing about machismo is you push it up so far, you dial it up so much, and then it just very quickly just becomes super gay and super homoerotic, right? In some ways, this is, and we had a quote the other week that Christy pulled about like how this is like, is this the gayest films? You know, in the same way that
he himself believes it's one of the gayest films ever made. So
I mean, your mileage may vary, right? In the same way that I think that a similar argument has been made for Top Gun, right? Where that's a very like sort of charged.
Like Top Gun has much more of that explicit, like, you know, there's a lot of like body on body action there, and there's a lot of like getting oiled up for the show and like slow motion bodies and things. I think in 300 it's much more the sort of unintentional homoeroticism of the gym rat. Like these guys who are like admiring male bodies because of how developed they are, and they don't realize that this is like hugely like homoerotic as well, and that there will be some people among their friend group who are enjoying this very differently.
Yes, exactly.
Well, and like one of the lines that I always used to scoff at is like when they accuse the Athenians of being boy lovers, and I always just read that and being like, but sorry, but like I almost read it more as like Gerard Butler looks to the side. It's like, because we love men.
Brilliant.
No, it's so weird when you know anything about Spartan society and you realize just how integral to their entire social system like these sort of relationships are, these male-male relationships, these homosocial and homosexual relationships, and you're just like, how can you put that line in there? But again, of course, you know, the modern man is a homophobe and a bigot, and he cannot possibly admit to being attracted to men. And this is like that whole same idea. It's just, it all boils down, as far as I can tell, like all the inexplicable lines can be explained by saying he can never possibly say anything that makes him less of a man. Right?
Yeah,
That's just not acceptable.
The way Xerxes is characterized as this kind of like, he wants to sleep with Leonidas. That's kind of also the latent fear going on there, right? Like, what's more scary is not only just this a massive army, but the guy is kind of sexually enticing you or something like that. And all this kind of speaks, I mean, one of the general critiques or criticisms that we and lots of people have kind of levied is the kind of deep hypocrisy that this worldview of masculinity, and picking Sparta to be the poster child, which stances on homosexuality being one thing, but also just like the idea of Sparta as like the bastion of freedom, which is a place that is arguably like one of the least free places that has ever existed, even for, right, not only was their whole population just depended upon mass enslavement, but also even the free citizens themselves lived these incredibly structured, rigid lives that just were, kind of laid out.
Well, I mean, modern scholarship has pushed back against that quite a bit. I mean, there's a lot more sort of recognition now that Spartans actually had quite a bit of leisure time. And this is kind of, it goes against the Spartan image in a different way, right? There's this idea that their lives were all regimented by their military needs. Actually, no, like they spend a lot of time just kind of hanging out with their buddies because, if you're a leisure class citizen, you don't have to work. You can do whatever you want. There's a lot of raising hunting dogs, raising horses. They have hobbies, they do rich people stuff because they're all rich guys, right? These are all leisure class citizens. And so that's kind of been sort of diminished a little bit. But like obviously they're not living in any kind of bastion of freedom. And in fact, when you look at the way that these guys in the movie talk, like they say they want freedom, but they actually want war, right? That's all they aspire to. They don't want to live in freedom. They want the Persians to come. They want the Persians to come again next year, right? That's all they dream about. So the idea doesn't actually work. These guys have no function being the way they are if there isn't a war going on.
I mean, that scene where they chide the other Greeks, I think it's like the Arcadians, whoever, for like having
profession.
Jobs. For like being potters and blacksmiths and things like that. And then
not a single farmer for some reason, but
that's so weird. Yeah, it's a real scene, right? So that's from Plutarch. So and Polyaenus has it as well. So it's about King Agesilaus who does this apparently when his allies complain. So this is a century out of place, but whatever, we'll go with it. But the idea is that he doesn't actually ask the Spartans what their profession is. He just makes everybody else sit down if they have a profession or something, or stand up. I don't remember which way around it goes. Until at the end, obviously, the Spartans are the only ones who haven't actually moved because they don't have
a job.
They're out of a job yet. They're kind of between jobs right now. You have to give them time. They're sorting themselves out, okay? They're kind of living on their mom's couch, but that's a normal thing.
They do CrossFit on the weekends. They're just figuring it out.
They're definitely hitting the gym and probably lawyering up.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry, I'm way off track, but...
No, but it's one of those moments where the movie takes something from another piece of our understanding of Sparta, from another source, and they move it out of place. They mix and match, obviously. They kind of do what they want with it. But it is very interesting that they're trying to pick those things. Like somebody did their homework. I don't remember if that one's in the graphic novel or if that's just in the movie, but somebody actually decided, okay, I'm going to read about these Spartans and what they're like. And you found this. And then they thought, this is a cool way of portraying their difference between them and other Greeks, I guess, which the Spartans did play up in this way. But they didn't mean we are all soldiers. They meant we are all free to do this. Whereas you guys have jobs to get back to. You pathetic fools. But obviously there were such people in other states as well. If they had talked to the Athenian cavalry or something like that, they would have not had any luck asking how many of them were potters and then blacksmiths,
There was one other thing, like a trope that I saw from this movie that I saw carried through in Spartacus that I thought was really interesting, and it went back to Gorgo, and like Gorgo seemed really cool. Later, the actress is Circe, so I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Circe. I hadn't watched in such a long time, and so like saw Michael Fassbender, and like, hey,
he's there.
Peter Mensa as the first Persian messenger and all of this, and the thing that was really interesting to me was Gorgo is basically she is raped. Like it's presented as like, she's offering up something, but it's like, no, that's still the definition. And she later gets to kill the guy who raped her in front of everyone. And then she's justified because he's got Persian coins on him. And this is something I saw in Spartacus a lot too, where like rape was often happened to the women, the female characters. And then we all felt really good when they killed their rapist. And that happened a lot. Like there was at least one of those almost every season, I feel like.
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting thing because, again, this is very hyper masculine. This idea that women are justified in using violence against their rapists. But then in our culture, we don't tend to believe women who make claims against men having raped them. And I thought that was such a weird trope that I kept seeing over and over again. And I don't know what to make it other than like she's justified because she also belonged to someone else that we actually view as the hero. Because that's Leonidas's wife. That was, it's usually the woman has another relationship. She's not just some random girl with no other associations. So I thought that was weird. I don't know what to make of it, but I did want to like note it because I'd seen it a lot.
Yeah, I don't really want to say that this is the reason, but I wonder if it's got something to do with the fact that a movie like this is basically unable to conceive of a female character as anything other than an object, essentially, right? So
Sure.
There's literally that scene where he asks her, what else could you offer? And it's like, obviously, there's only one thing that she could possibly offer because she's basically an object. The only thing is that this movie does defy that when the messenger comes to Sparta and Leonidas clearly defers to her
Right.
about the decision, which is a really interesting moment that kind of goes against everything else in the movie. Because Gorgo historically is, noted for her wit. Like, she is a really smart person from childhood. Like, there are several anecdotes about how clever she is and how much she exemplifies the sort of perfect Spartan queen. And so, they could have done a lot more with that, but instead they have this whole narrative that you've just summarized, where it's just like, you feel really awful about it. Is this really what you wanted with this character? Like, that's all you're giving her to do? And they made that up for the movie, right? That's definitely not in the graphic novel.
Yeah, like even the book about the Battle of Thermopylae, Herodotus ends with the account of like, and how did all the Hellenes know about this? Well, the traitor guy hanging out sent a secret message by like scraping off wax, writing the message on the wood, then putting wax back on, sent it to Sparta, and no one could figure out like what was this blank message about except for Gorgo. And I'm like, that's so cool. They did her so terrible in this movie.
Well, she is legitimately cool, and they could have done anything, right? Like, if you're gonna make up a story about Gorgo because you want this, the one female character to have, a little bit more to do that. Have that episode in there.
Yeah.
To that point, like, there's basically only one other woman in this whole movie, and it's the Oracle girl, who similarly even sort of worse, where she just sort of exists to be leered at, first by the audience and then by the kind of creepy syphilitic he-fours.
Yeah. No, and Christy, I have a theory. I do. Okay. I think it's this, and again, it fits very well into this very hyper-masculine worldview, where it's that, like, if the, like, assault was real and true, then, like, you would have fought back and you would have, like, killed them. I feel like that's kind of the framework that they're working in. Like, that if it was this bad and this awful, obviously you would just kill them.
Yeah. Which is literally the rhetoric that Varro used for his wife in season 1 of Spartacus. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel like maybe that's the framework that they're working within, both in 300 and Spartacus.
What a terrifying world if like women just collectively decided, okay, we'll just do that then.
Okay, I'll just kill you.
Have you seen Promising Young Woman?
This is actually ancient Greek as well. Like, people said this about Helen.
Yeah. Like I think it's like you have to scream, like, and you have to have been hurt, and it depends on the location. Because surely, like in the city, it wouldn't happen. But if you are kidnapped and taken outside of the city, then you have to scream, and someone has to hear the scream for it to be legitimate. Yeah.
No, Colin, you said Promising Young Woman, and I'm like, yeah, that's yeah.
But a very different kind of approach to the whole, less through that kind of masculine lens that this movie and presumably Spartacus has towards the subject.
Yeah.
Well, with that, we could either talk about the racism there's racism, there's
take your pick. Do you want the ableism or the racism? Yeah,
there's racism, ableism, or we can get into the actual battles, which Roel is our specialist for today. Like, there's a lot of ways to take this.
All these light topics for us.
Yeah, truly, right? We brought you on for the fun and easy one.
It's like what stratigraphy? What layer do we want to tackle first, basically?
Racism.
Racism. Yay.
Say, like, I don't have much more to add to this that hasn't been sort of said already. And this movie has a very sort of Western centric, Eurocentric, East versus West mentality that even when it came out, people were kind of picking up on. And it's, all non-white people are either cretins or monsters or demons or something, right? And some of like the immortals are like, orcs
or
basically.
goat,
right?
Or one's a goat. I don't understand where the sitar playing goat comes
it's just a hat, right? Like just wearing a goat.
Definitely wearing a goat. No, there is a weirdness about it in the sense that obviously Orientalism is racist to begin with, right? This whole idea of the Eastern other that they're really like buying into, which is obviously already exists in ancient Greece. This idea that Persians are too rich and too decadent, and that makes them weak and soft and sinister and whatever else. Like all that kind of whole stereotype starts with them, right? But then it's almost like this movie thought, and it does this with a lot of things, that it takes something that is already there in the sources in ancient Greek and the way we tell the story, and it's like, yeah, but can we make it like worse?
Yeah.
Can we go further? And they're just like, we can't just be racist. We have to literally go to the extent that the enemy army, the invading army, is not just diverse. It is literally monstrous. Like it is animalistic. It has these sort of weird, deformed figures. And in a way, you can say that famous scene where Xerxes says, I will embrace you. Like all you have to do is kneel. It's inclusive, but in a way that makes inclusivity look like corruption, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is something that I don't really necessarily blame either Zack Snyder because he's not like, I don't think he necessarily wants that message out. I don't know if he's even thought about it, or even Frank Miller, because I don't think it's that extreme in the book. Like he just has some concubines dance or something. It's really just, they tried to go even further with it and they made it like so much worse.
I mean, it's kind of a theme that really kind of permeates. I mean, it goes all the way back, like you said, to kind of, the idea of physiognomy, right? That like inner beauty, outer beauty are going to be sort of reflective in one another, right? Go back to Homer, the one poor person that talks Thersites, he's described as like kind of ugly and balding and misshapen. And he's kind of this, this rabble rouser type. But you see it all throughout like the fantasy genre as well. And in comic books and superheroes, that good people look good and bad people look bad, right? They're reflected on that, the inside and the outside is a reflection of one another. And so it's a larger literary trope. And then it's just really kind of taken to a very extreme. And I wonder if even this movie is like taking it to the point where now like it's bringing it to such a point that like audiences are saying like, oh wait, hang on, like it's the one step too far that really sort of exposes the sort of underlying kind of sinisterness of the idea.
Yeah, I mean it's technically pro eugenics too, right? Because like opening scene, we're gonna dump the baby.
Yes.
And Leish, how did you feel about all of the fully intact infant skeletal structure?
I felt furious, and I feel like I mentioned this in when Colin and I talked about it. I was like, that's not what baby skeletons look like. Stop doing this to me and other archaeologists.
I can excuse the racism, but I draw the line up here.
I draw the line at skeletons.
From a literary historical perspective, this whole like throwing babies off cliffs, I mean, very few people still believe that the Spartans actually did this.
Oh,
like,
right?
It's just, it's only one source that ever mentions it 600 years after the supposed event. Like this is completely obscure and really not attested anywhere else. In fact, we have, disabled Spartan kings. There's plenty of evidence of disabled Spartiates. So they probably just never did this. But the movie wants that in there, either because they're uncritically repeating Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, or more sinisterly, insidiously, because they actually, as you said, like because they're pro-eugenics, because they think this is a good idea.
Yeah, and the traitor, I can't ever
Ephialtes.
Yeah. He is only saved because of the love of his mother, which is also like, and that's just it. Love is shown to be the weak, again, hyper-masculine. Love is weakness. We do not speak of it. Yeah. We know it's there because we lock eyes seriously, but we don't speak of it. And it's just like, oh my gosh, there's no, like Spartacus wasn't that bad at least. And it was bad in some respects, but it's like, no, when people actually cared about each other, they told, like, I think the only instance you got of that was the father's son, like when his son is beheaded in front of him, and then he's like, I'm really sad.
But it only
it's like
expresses through rage, right?
Yeah. My heart is filled with hatred, and Leonidas goes, good.
Yeah.
It's that. It validates the idea that the only expression of emotion that's appropriate is anger, right? It's exactly that toxic masculinity in a nutshell, basically.
The joke, men will literally fight 1 million Persians, then you go to therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing from, because I reread my landmark Herodotus, just kind of like, okay, what was actually there? The killing of the messengers, that's actually told by Herodotus, but apparently the Athenians were the ones who made theirs go down a pit, and the Spartans like threw theirs down a well. And then the Spartans had to send two of there's like, we got to make up for it. So they send two of their men to Xerxes, being like, hey, we're here. Punish us how you will. And Xerxes sends it back, being like, I'm not as terrible as you guys are. Like, come on.
It's such a perfect story. This is the thing, like the movie turns this into some kind of like gesture of defiance, like something to be praised because they're just making a point about their foreign policy. They will not submit. In fact, they will kill your messengers instead of sending them back with their rejection. And it's just like, no, this was a massive crime, like sacrilege. Like the Spartans carried this curse, according to Herodotus, for 5 decades, right?
Yeah.
They were cursed, like super fucking cursed because they did this.
Yeah. Yeah.
This, I mean, the bringing into, like, as we kind of mentioned, like the larger kind of thing that interests me, I think, a lot of this movie is the fascination with Sparta. And that fascination really begins in antiquity, where, like, I mean, most of what we know, I think, about Sparta comes from guys like Herodotus, who are sort of not Spartan, or Plutarch, who's much, much after the fact. You know, and Sparta had this, you know, its sort of glory point was like pretty short-lived, as I understand it. But then it was always a like point of fascination, both for other Greeks and then later Romans and then now us, right? And like with this idea of like a point of fixation for people's imaginations and all the stuff that was going down there.
I think in scholarship it's called like the Spartan Mirage. And I was going back through one of my history books, and it just talks about how even like Germany was, you know, Nazi Germany was modeling a lot of their, if you think about the Agoge and what they were doing with their young boys in Germany at the time, it's like, oh, okay.
Well, and like talk about eugenics, like.
So Helen Roche has written a really brilliant book about this. The way that the first is the Prussian cadet schools, like, so this is earlier. This is like in the 19th century. These guys go all in for the idea that they are training their kids. They literally call themselves like little Spartans, right? They are drilling themselves, and like the regime in these schools is absolutely harrowing. Like these are the kind of people who would go to these British boarding schools and say like, no wonder why you British officers are all so soft. Like this is their whole life is just suffering, and they valorize it. Like they think that that's how you become a true Prussian. And then later on, it gets picked up, you know, from the same source essentially by the Nazis for the same reason, because they think that, you know, it is this form of masculinity where you deny yourself everything, and you are denied everything, and you're constantly made to suffer because it builds character or something. They valorize it, and they think that this is right, and it turns you into the kind of citizen that you ought to be. Now, whether the Spartans ever actually did this is a whole other question, but certainly that is one of the ways in which the idea of Sparta has been reapplied in modern times. And you can see this movie really fits into that version, that idea of Sparta. And it really wants you to believe that, yeah, like, I mean, the way it portrays it, like, since he could stand, he was baptized in the fires of combat. Like, you have a 2-year-old, like, having a punch up with another kid.
It's like grown men just beating the crap out of kids.
Right.
Yeah. And like Xenophon is one of the few, like Herodotus is technically contemporary, but Xenophon is like contemporary and actually hung out with the Spartans, even though he wasn't Spartan himself. And
his sons went through the upbringing. He sent his sons to Sparta to be educated. So
yeah, but even he was saying it's like, you know, things that had been laid out by Lycurgus weren't really being administered to that extent at the time he was there. So it's like there'd obviously been some change, and like this idea of it being uber conservative though, and like, and my history book made the point, it's like arguably both Spartans and Athenians hated change at the end of the day.
But it's also like the idea of the way Sparta works. I mean, this is what the modern Sparta scholarship is going on about, right? It's the idea that you don't just have a society that invents itself and then continues for 400 years in that form. It's a society that tells that story while constantly changing. So whenever they come up with a new law, they credit it to Lycurgus, which gives, you know, in hindsight, gives the impression that Lycurgus came up with everything just sort of, you know, popped out of his head like Athena. But actually, you know, this is just a constantly changing state that's adapting to circumstance and adapting to events and adapting to, you know, changing environments. And so it's a complete lie that Sparta is sort of this hidebound traditionalist culture that sort of defines itself at one point in time and then never changes. It's adapting. And what Xenophon is telling you is also what Plutarch is telling you, is that this place keeps changing based on what happens around it and what happens within it. And so this idea that it was ever like that. I mean, one of the great examples in the movie, they actually twice use the word agoge for the Spartan upbringing. That word is not used for the Spartan upbringing until the Hellenistic period. right? They call it the paideia. Everybody calls it the paideia until the Hellenistic period.
Just a word for
That's the education. That's the only
basically.
word for it, right?
Yeah.
And so the movie is actually telling you without realizing that, no, this state changes, right?
Yeah.
Right.
There was so many weird anachronisms of like even modern language going in. So like, tonight we dine in hell.
Where's that then?
There's that. And then there was a mention of like, Leonidas has broken the law. He'll go to jail. And I'm like, jail, huh?
Yeah, what's jail?
Jail. Spartan jail. Yes. No, and the fact that all the metal is cast,
Yeah.
it has that weird pitted texture, right? Like
Oh,
everything is down to the coins, which is like the number one way to see if a coin is fake is if it's cast.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how they made
So
coins.
funny.
Well, even when they're showing Sparta and they're like, look at all that wonderful marble work they got going. And you're just like, no,
It's,
guys.
they
I
have
mean,
a
we're not
council
even
house that looks-
acknowledging that they just have a giant pit in like the middle of their town that's just open.
They had a well, according to Herodotus, which
How do you get water out of that well? There's no buckets. It exists solely so you can kick people down it. Let's be real.
You missed your chance to go. It was a well, actually.
was a well. I don't know the difference, really. It's like it's basically a pit in the ground, too, but okay.
No, but like you did have wells all over these ancient Greek towns, and in fact, Athens was a city of wells. Like they had wells and cisterns absolutely everywhere. So it's not that weird to have a well in the middle of town. Obviously, to have it that exposed is a little bit strange, and to have it that big and deep is pointless. But at the same time, like it's fine to have a well, and obviously they had a well big enough to kick some emissaries into, and presumably they weren't using it after that. So it must have
Oh,
been
yeah, right?
I mean, that's not uncommon either. Like wells that have fallen out of use, you do get a lot of garbage and human remains.
For
So
sure. Yep.
plausible thing. I also just made another connection to Spartacus. I'm like, that's where the cliffside came from. It's like, how can we do the Sparta kick? But like a pit doesn't seem plausible. Let's build the ludus right on a cliff and call it a day.
Oh my God.
Because you got to have like vertigo be an element of this somehow. I don't know.
You already mentioned that it's a thing in Assassin's Creed Odyssey as well, right? This has become one of the things that Spartans now do. Apparently, they kick
Kick
people.
people off of cliffs.
The Athenians did admire their thighs.
I mean,
What those
to be
thigh
fair,
flappers,
I
yeah.
also admire their thighs, but whatever.
To be fair, that was also Athenian women admiring Spartan women's thighs. So, like,
To be fair,
where's
I
that?
would also admire those, whatever. Equal opportunity thighs.
The line in Aristophanes, right, where like when the Athenian women are just looking at it like, wow, you look like you could strangle a bull or something like that.
Yes.
Lumpy toe is,
So
absolutely
good.
hardcore.
All right, so I feel like we hit the racism and then we got off track. What was our next?
I mean, we've
Was our
talked a
next
little
layer?
bit. We've talked a little bit about the ableism too, with the eugenics and everything there.
Actually, about the ableism, there's one thing I want to say about that, which is
Yeah.
that is the one moment when the movie actually has Leonidas do something wrong, right?
Mhm.
It's acknowledged that he does a stupid thing. Nick, he tells this man to take a hike, and he obviously then goes to Xerxes and betrays him. And it's like, this is very much the only thing he ever does wrong, and it's being too ableist to allow someone to be part of his army. It's very
It
strange.
seems like a
going through
weird
that.
tactical blunder to the guy comes with the secret passage and then you just let him go after insulting him and really kind of breaking his hearts and his dreams, and you just let him walk off. But oh well.
Was it that insulting though? Because he wasn't even being like, "Get out of here." He was like, "Hey, there's other important roles that you could be useful for." Like I totally thought too. It's like, yeah, you just get them out. It's like, first of all, where are all the slaves helping with all of that work? How are these men eating?
Yeah.
That would muddle the thesis of the movie.
Carry any food or pans, let alone have helots there to do the work for them.
Right?
Yeah. And so it's like, so he actually named some really important roles that need to be filled. So it's like, it wasn't a complete dismissal, which I thought is in my memory is what had happened. But so it's like, it wasn't quite that bad. But my thought too, with, his logic of like, protect the guy to your left. I'm like, we'll just put him at the end, right?
Just
Like,
put 'em at the end.
Well, I mean, but to kind of counter a little bit, Christy, but like in this movie's, we're like in the scene where Leonidas basically shames everybody for having normal jobs, like in that kind of same worldview, like cleaning wounds feels like kind of a slap in the face, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's the idea the movie portrays that the Spartans basically want to die, like they're a death cult, right? In this movie. So they want that death in battle. They don't want to stand by the sidelines. That's what they live for. And so you can imagine that if somebody is brought up in that value system, that they actually would see it as not just beneath them, but like, that is ruining their life's opportunity. Unless the Persians just come back next year, which would be cool.
and that's the thing. Like it's not a death cult, right? Like the reason they want fights is like you get loot out of it. You get a bunch of stuff to take home, and I mean that's kind of what all the early, archaic fighting. That's what Homeric fighting is really about. Is just going and sacking cities and taking their stuff.
I would say it's also about like the glory, right? There's a sort of abstract like
Leos
concept of like exercising your prowess and skill, right? So I feel like there's like the monetary value, I guess, but there's also just like the social, I guess, value that you get from being seen, right?
By the classical period, they're no longer really dividing the spoils, right? So mostly they're just like centralizing that and selling it centrally so that they can put that money in the treasury. So for the most part, they're not actually getting their personal gain out of it, which means their narrative has to shift. And so this is when you get this kind of thing that, advertises that you have to do your duty to the community, and your business is to go and fight for your city or for whoever, is leading you. And your most glorious thing is to obey orders and put up with it. And so what they're fighting for, why they think this is worth doing, is to some extent that they want to live up to that ideal. And to another extent is obviously the idea that if they do so successfully, then good things follow in terms of wealth, in terms of glory, or whatever else might be at the end of that.
And there is, it's in Herodotus, I think, where a guy missed the battle because of some reason, like he was a messenger or something.
Eye disease.
Yes. And then he comes back and he's basically like shamed and bullied into taking his own life later by the rest of the Spartans. And then to me, I always want that story always smacks to me of a little bit of that like Spartan obsession of like that they would do, like there's the subtext maybe in Herodotus is like that they would do this at all is a little bit kind of wild, but.
Yeah, although, so this is like the Tres Antes laws, right? So the people who run away from battle are supposedly punished in this way. It's like a form of atimia, a form of loss of citizen rights. Or partial loss of citizen rights, which supposedly, Herodotus describes it and Xenophon describes it as like there are all these consequences attached to being considered a coward. And so these two guys who survived Thermopylae are branded this way. One of them takes his own life. The other one is Aristodemus, who is in the movie as Delios, as David Wenham's character. He then has to sort of tries to redeem himself at the Battle of Plataea. But the idea is that, so there are terrible things that they are subjected to, right? Like no one will talk to them. They have to wear rags. They have to shave half their beards, and they get picked last at ball games.
Darn.
It's a shunning.
Yeah, I know. Like, we can all remember that from school. How the true social ostracism. But Xenophon specifically says that they get picked last at ball games. Wonderful thing. Wonderful little detail. The thing is, both of these guys describe the system of laws. Aristodemus is the only person in history who is known to have suffered that punishment, right? No one else in all of Spartan history, because every time they actually lose a battle, which they do on occasion, they will say, you know what? Let's not enforce the law. They will find a reason to not have to punish hundreds, if not thousands of their own citizens, because they know that this is a really bad idea, which is going to create this huge sort of body of discontented, citizens within your citizen body. And so they can't do it. They don't do it. It is only ever Aristodemus who survives Thermopylae. That's the only guy. And so when we pretend that this is something that would happen to Spartans when they run away from battle, no, it wouldn't happen to Spartans. It happened to that one guy. And so this is not at all something that we can then extrapolate to the Spartan experience of how they behave or what they think is going to happen to them. Because in reality, most of the time, if they run away from battle, they're probably pretty confident that if there are enough of them running away, it's not going to matter. And there are literally 3 different occasions when the laws are allowed to sleep, basically. Like there are many more occasions of that happening that are explicitly attested than this one guy who is punished with the Tres Antes law. The other thing, of course, is that the same law exists at Athens, but,
Yeah. Sure. Well, isn't it like Leonidas? I think even in Herodotus, it talks about like Leonidas is the one who like, he sends a lot of people away for the final stand, but he also sends these 2 men because of the eye disease they're experiencing. It's like, hey, we need to get some messengers out. And I think the reason Herodotus is of the idea is like the reason like one avoided the consequence is because like he came back and made a helot, one of his slaves, direct him to where the battle was so that he could go and fight afterwards. And Herodotus is like, if both of them had just gone and not come back, no one probably would have said anything about the one guy.
Yep.
And I think that's probably pretty accurate. But like it's strategic, right? Like Leonidas is making a call right there and then of, you know, he's not sure if all of the troops under him are loyal in that final stand, but also if they all die in that final stand, like they're likely to, it's one battle. There's a whole war to be fought here. So like it strategically makes sense to get him out.
Well, it strategically makes sense not to fight to the death.
That whole like that final stand, the same as the Alamo, is like most people look at the Alamo and be like, not a great idea, guys. I don't know. Like,
what I love about this movie is that it makes no apologies for it. It literally presents it as a bad idea. Like he hears that the Persians are coming and he just goes like he has this big grin on his face and then he gives this speech where he's just fucking delighted because he gets to die by Persian, right?
Yeah.
It's just like the Arcadians are leaving. It's like, well, there's no point staying. We can still get away. Like there's time. We can just fight.
You can retreat to the isthmus, which everyone has acknowledged this whole time is a great strategic location to make a stand.
Well, the Athenians
want to do, right? That's how they want to fight. I mean, you know, much to the chagrin of Athens, but like they want to fight the isthmus. Fine, you can do that. You can fight another day. You don't have to throw these lives away for literally no purpose. And Leonidas is like, no.
Yeah. This is a question that I had that like in my mind, like this movie, although it's not unique to this movie, kind of frames Thermopylae as one of these like linchpin decision turning point history battles, right? Where like had it gone the other way, right? History as we know it would have been totally different. And I've always, you know, like I feel like this movie kind of tacitly puts forward the thesis that, right, like we wouldn't have a democracy if not for Thermopylae is kind of the idea. And I've always been really skeptical of that, you know, I mean, many battles, but this one especially is getting that kind of like did this battle matter that much? Like in the scheme of, I don't know.
I mean, in the grand scheme of the Persian Wars, it absolutely had no influence whatsoever. It held the Persians up for a week. That was literally the full extent of it. And nothing was done in that week, so it wasn't even buying anyone any time.
The Olympics were happening at the time, so the Olympic Games happened.
So I guess, you know, everybody was having a great time at the Olympics. Hopefully they had some good events. So the much more important battle that's happening at Artemision, which is the naval battle that was being fought at the same time, which was a much bigger undertaking. There were 40,000 Greeks there. They fought the Persian fleet to a standstill, which is a huge achievement. It gave them the confidence to try again at Salamis, which proved to be the first victory of the Persian Wars. So that is where the important stuff is happening. The next year, the Spartans fight a really important and decisive battle at Plataea, which most people don't even know about.
It's the epilogue in this movie.
It's the epilogue in this movie, which is like, no, but why didn't you make a movie about that one? If you want big, spectacular action, there is a movie right there with like 40,000 Greek hoplites on one side and perhaps the same number of Persians. And you could have this, you know, you could have this huge thing. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that like there's a difference between what's actually decisive. Thermopylae didn't make any difference to anything, right? The only thing I would say is probably it was a huge morale boost to Xerxes because he won. Basically, that was his first battle and he won and he killed a king. So that's great. Like that didn't even need to happen, but he just gave it away. Okay, that's cool. So probably his army was in really high spirits after that. So they were having a great time. But the thing is, the story has become so famous that you could argue that in the actual long run, this is one of the most famous, if not the most famous battle in history, right? Most people will know what Thermopylae is about. It's in everything. There's references to it everywhere. We recently watched the Halos show where obviously these guys are called Spartans anyway, but they have a whole episode in the latest season that's just called Thermopylae. And it is kind of about the idea that as part of their training, they just have to go stand somewhere in a narrow space and get beaten up. There's like no point to it except that you're going to lose, but you're going to love it. It's like a really weird thing. But like, so there's people are thinking about it still. People are thinking about it in different ways. People are trying to do things with it, trying to tell that story in ways that they still find inspiring. People want to look up to Leonidas and want to look up to the Spartans for this. So whatever it actually was, I mean, it's deformed out of all, recognition. And it's a story that's still, 2007, they make this movie.
I mean, even I was just thinking like its importance for like just modern Greek national identity that like,
Oh, yeah.
as Greece itself is creating its own nation, it looks to Thermopylae as like a, model or an inspiration, which is why it's got, there's a huge landmark to it in the middle on the site.
It's interesting because it's one of these weird underdog loser stories that in historical events that is strangely really popular. Hannibal, Spartacus, of like the little guy tried really hard.
Oh, did he though? Because that's the thing about Leonidas is that he's a nobody, right? Like he came out of nowhere. He became king when he was already 50. 10 years later, he leads his first army, as far as we can tell, ever. This is his first deed on record, other than possibly killing his half-brother to get the throne. I mean, this is kind of not certain, but like he does nothing until this thing. And he, makes a mess of it and dies. That's, like,
but we love him for it for some reason.
He's not Hannibal, he's not remembered forever for his tactical genius and his ability to show up an entire, nascent empire. No, this is just a guy who leads one insufficient force to a battle that he loses.
I even wonder, like Custer. I mean, I've been thinking you mentioned the Alamo, Christy, but like like General Custer, right? Which was like I think a similarly like. It's a weirdly glorified battle that of an actual very dumb thing to do.
Well, and like especially because we have talked about this before, when we're looking at reception of Greece versus reception of Rome, Greece is always usually like mythology. Like the weird exceptions is 300 and Alexander for the most part, but then Rome you got everyone covered at some point, and it's all historical figures. And it's really interesting to think of like, but there are some cool historical moments. There are certain figures we know of, like Pericles, but it's like, but also that was a war of attrition that ended poorly for Pericles. So,
well, he didn't last very long. It's fine.
No, he did not. But it's like, why? Yeah, why is there not the same interest in showing more like Greek military history, or I would even like other Greek history, but still.
Whenever a game or anything else has Leonidas as a character again, I'm always just like, why is this the one Greek you go to? Because it's the one Greek name but like he achieved nothing, right? Like absolutely nothing. He didn't even win his only battle. And so you can go to so many figures. Even in Spartan history, you can go to numerous people who actually did at least win one battle, like it's a low bar, I feel. But people just don't know because people know this story. And the reason they know this story is because it's just such a symbol of what it is in the movie as well. It's this idea of, selflessly sacrificing yourself for something you believe in because it is what you believe your entire life built up to. And they kind of try to make that to sell that idea. They don't really sell the idea that this is the right moment to do that. But I think they really sell the ideology that makes you do that. Like they build up these guys who only just want to fight and they only want to die, and that's all they live for. And so when the opportunity comes, they're not going to walk away from it. They're going to take it because that's literally all they want to do.
And I'm wondering even now of like, I don't actually know if there'd be a way to like track or chart this of like the sort of relative popularity of the story over time. But it seems like this would be a thing that would start to really capture the imaginations in the 17 and 1800s as you're getting like revolutions and nations defining, and the idea of like, right, laying your life down for whatever it is, for freedom, for, fraternity, equality, liberty, all that kind of stuff.
But Leonidas doesn't do that, right? I mean, he does it in this movie, but he doesn't in Herodotus.
Yeah, but then that this story kind of becomes like Trojan horsed or something into this idea.
Yeah. Well, I'm also thinking just about like this to an American audience about like, how predatory a lot of army advertising is in like the, do something great for a greater good,
the appeal to duty.
Yeah. So I can see that like leaning into it, especially for an American audience specifically.
Well, and that's what these militias in the United States are doing too, right? They're very much using the imagery of ancient Rome, ancient Spartans.
I remember, I think I was in the car with my sister and we were driving somewhere and somebody had a Molin Labe bumper sticker or like tire cover or something like that. And usually you see one of those, and that's usually a red flag for like this is a Second Amendment or a gun nut or something like that.
And I always just want to scream at them. It's like, come and take it. They did, you fools. They did.
They did.
They proved themselves more than up to the task. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is like, this is also a thing, like, you know, when we tell the story as this great, even the movie tries to sell it as a victory, right? Like secretly you won, even though
moral,
you but like we don't talk about it as, you know, a great tactical victory for the Persians in the way of both like achieving their aim of clearing the pass and defeating the enemy army, but even the way they did it, where they just kind of keep them pinned from the front and maneuver another detachment around the rear. I mean, this is quite a complex operation that they pulled off within a very short amount of time, and depending on your interpretation, with minimal losses. So it's really quite, you know, an effective way of overrunning that position, which, you know, the Romans do that later on when the Seleucids hold the pass and things like that. Like, it's not necessarily easy, but the most capable armies in antiquity were able to do it. And this is really what we should be talking about. But instead, because we only know this story from essentially the way the Spartans want you to hear it, we think that they did this amazing thing. But actually, when you read Herodotus, who was at least a little bit critical about that, you can read between the lines and say, like, actually, this is not what you say it is.
I have this very clear memory of in the part in Herodotus where he describes, because I think it's the Phocians or whoever it is that's stationed in the pass, and then when they see the Persians coming, they like run up to a top of the hill, and then the Persians just kind of run right past them, and the whole scene kind of plays out this like almost comical of like, it seems to be a very sort of a breakdown in communication or whatever is supposed to be happening.
Yeah, at least Leonidas knew about the goat path, which they actually do portray in the movie as well. He sends the Phocians up there. But like, as they in fact say in the movie, which I appreciate the fact that they tried to stay true to that part of the narrative at least. They said the Phocians just let them pass by without a fight. Some modern scholarship suggests that, yeah, they basically betrayed the Greek cause there. Like, they were just like, you know what? If you spare our town, we'll let you through, basically.
Yeah, and that's something that like the movie doesn't do at all, right? Like, it makes it seem like all of the Greeks are united, but like all the city-states are making independent decisions of like what's going to be the best option for us. And that's like why Leonidas doesn't trust the Thebans, because they're a group that like could go either way.
Yeah, there's a lot of Greeks already on the Persian side, especially in the fleet, of course, but even on the land, I mean, they've already overrun Thessaly, and you know, Macedonians and others are already in that army. So I really should be speaking about the allied Greeks, and I try to do this when I write it, when I talk about this. It's like, they're not the Greeks resisting, it's the allied Greeks, those who have decided to resist, which, you know, you can go to Istanbul and see the monument they set up at Delphi, which was brought there eventually, and you can see the names of the cities. There are 31 cities, most of which you've never heard of, because they're really small places in the Peloponnese. The main ones are basically Athens and Sparta.
My sort of hot take was that Thebans did nothing wrong. I would have done probably the exact same thing in their position.
100%, right?
Yeah.
For the trouble.
So I guess that we could actually just talk about some of the battle scenes, because the only tactic that Herodotus really mentioned in this fight was that the Spartans would look like they're retreating and then suddenly turn around and they would be able to kill a bunch of people that way, other than, you know, holding this narrow passage. And that's it. And so both Frank Miller and Zack Snyder had a lot of leeway with that, it seems like, as a result. So.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. I mean, the thing is, I was at a conference about Sparta not like a few weeks ago, and somebody was asking me about it because I'm supposed to be the guy who knows about warfare stuff. I can't explain that passage in Herodotus. Nobody else there could explain it either. There are different theories. It's a very weird passage because the Spartans are said to have done something that they never do again, right? This is a completely unique event, and something that requires a lot of coordination. So if they could do something like that, it's very strange that they never did so again. And in fact, it's very strange that they could do it then, because this is clearly an army that doesn't have the same level of training that the later Spartan armies of the classical period do. And so it's inexplicable that they could do something that sophisticated and complex. And my theory really is that Herodotus heard something else, or heard something he didn't quite understand, and misinterpreted it and gave this account because he felt that it was appropriate for the Spartans to fight memorably, right? Like, he has this repeated phrase where he believes that they are actually know what they're doing and nobody else does. And so I think he's making it up. I don't think there's actually anything very special about the way the Spartans fought. But in fact, the whole narrative is corrupt, right? Like, we don't know, in the sense that Herodotus tells us they built a wall. but then he has them fighting something like a land battle, like with these kind of maneuvers and things like that. They cannot both happen. There's no space in the past. You've been there, you've seen it. You can't have both. And so in the movie, they have this weird thing where they build the wall in order to narrow the pass, but so that they can have their cake and eat it too. But Herodotus doesn't say that. He says they built a wall. So most likely this battle is a siege battle, right? They are defending a wall against Persian attacks. The Persians aren't able to crack that, so they go around. That's what's happening. There is no field battle. There is no engagement in the open. But the Spartans want you to think there was, because that's how you get glory as a Spartan hoplite, right? That's how Spartans are supposed to fight. And so the whole, we have nothing in the narrative of the fighting that we can rely on, that we can say, okay, this definitely happened at Thermopylae. And in fact, the most detailed account of the fighting is with the 300 fighting over the body of Leonidas, which, no one survived that. That's the whole point.
Yeah, that was very Homeric. And I'm like, oh, I'm having flashbacks to the fight over Patroclus's body and things like that.
It's clearly the inspiration, but no one could have told him that, right? Unless he was talking to the Persians who did the killing.
Right.
I mean, there's many points in Herodotus you can point to that might be the result of an odd game of telephone, or just a mishearing, or even just either Herodotus or somebody else is pulling our chain.
I mean, most likely he talked to the Thebans who were there. This is definitely something that we can tell from his narrative. Like, he had some kind of contact with the Thebans, so maybe they saw it happen. But, you wouldn't keep those guys around when they surrendered.
Exactly.
Yeah. Herodotus said something about, like, the Thebans, like, surrendered and said, like, they'd been forced to fight, which is kind of true based on what Herodotus said. But I think they were all enslaved, is what he said was kind of the result of it. So
he says they were branded with the mark. For the Greeks, it's basically the same thing. If you have tattoos or brands, you're enslaved.
Because you're also, like, if you are a person who's enslaved from fighting, you're probably going to do some very hard labor and not have a long life at that point either.
Yeah, although some of those Thebans, I don't actually know what happens to them. I think so. It was their families, because they're prominent families. Like, the guy who was captured there as the general of the Thebans is the grandfather of the guy who is the general of the Thebans when they attack Plataea in the Peloponnesian War. So there's, like, a clear sort of link between those. Like, he's a very prominent family in Thebes. So even if he was maybe carried off to somewhere in the Persian Empire, I mean, his family didn't lose their status. So much more likely, actually, that they were returned to Thebes when it was captured. That these people were essentially, they were branded for their resistance, but they weren't necessarily deported.
Which I think is the other problem with the movie, right? Is that, like, this whole premise, Xerxes is coming in and, like, what he is offering is slavery for everyone. And it's like, that's not how empires work. The people in power, they tend to keep in those relative positions of power, just slightly, under their ruler, so that they don't want to rebuild a hierarchy every single place they go to. They just want to put themselves at the top of it. So that's why it's not unusual. A lot of city-states are like, yeah, we can live with that.
Yeah. I mean, the Persians, as a rule, don't interfere in local rule. Like, they don't upset constitutions or anything like that. They might install tyrants to rule on their behalf. But otherwise, if a city doesn't like that and is able to negotiate that they can keep their own laws, I mean, Xerxes doesn't care. I mean, he just wants the tribute, right? He just wants the tribute and the service. And so, yeah, I mean, they let the Ionians have their democracies, right, after the Ionian revolt. This is something that Herodotus, like, underlines, where he's like, look, I told you the Persians would condone democracy. He's, like, very, like, he wants you to know that this is not an ideological position. They're not opposed to democracy. They are, in favor of people being good little subjects, by whatever means necessary, essentially.
Any other parts of the movie that we want to talk about or haven't talked about yet?
So one of the things that I really want to talk about is this thing I'm constantly being told by people whenever I say that this isn't accurate. Like, I will say, oh, but this isn't historically what happened, and there's all sorts of things wrong with both the physical elements and the narrative elements and the characters. And they will say, well, it's because it's not a true story, right? It's the way that Delios Aristodemus tells the story. So it's really just an unreliable narrator, right? Like, you're just being told this version of the story because it's the story that he needs in order to inspire the Spartans, right? And I remember when I was coming out of the cinema, talking to my friend that I was watching this thing with, and saying, like, okay, well, that wasn't, there were rhinos, but we agreed, like, but this is the kind of story that a Spartan would like to hear. And that's what I thought at the time when I was like 17. And I look back on that and I think, that isn't right. The story the Spartans wanted to tell is the story we have. Like the story of Thermopylae that we have, and I keep coming back to this, like the way that we read it in Herodotus and the way that we read it in other sources, Diodorus, Plutarch, Justin, Pausanias, that is the story that the Spartans wanted you to hear, right? That is the Spartan propaganda story. So what this movie is doing is like taking that and then just going like, but what if, rhinos, elephants, all sorts of things that this Delios character could not possibly have known existed in the world because this isn't a part of his frame of reference. Naphtha throwers and like all sorts of weird like alien creatures that don't, like, none of this is real. Like you can say, oh, he's just making it up as he goes along, but he doesn't have to do that. We have the story that the Spartans told. We know how they want you to tell this story.
Yeah, especially like the moment when the ships go through the storm and they're like, oh, Zeus. It's like that is kind of the framing at the time of like, yeah, the gods are on our side right now at the moment. And
yes, like this narrative that you get, like, oh, it's because this guy is just telling it in a particular way because that's what the Spartans like to hear. It's like, no, he's distorting what the Spartans like to hear. He's turning it into something that has nothing to do with that. So it's absolutely valid to attack it for its inaccuracies, both because it isn't accurate, but also because it isn't even accurate to the propaganda. It's not even doing a good job of telling the Spartan story.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wonder too, it's because that was kind of the realization I had again. It's like, oh yeah, the one voice we're hearing mostly is this narrator, and the narrator is not Herodotus, which I thought also could have been kind of an interesting way to play it.
Sure. Yeah.
Instead of,
by David Wenham.
Yes. I'd take it.
Yeah. But and then there are just moments where you're like, the guy with the scythe arms who's beheading a general, I'm like, what is this?
I call him General Lobster Man, but
yeah,
does look like a lobster. Okay,
excellent.
The number of slow motion beheadings, but also the way that Xerxes looks. I mean, we all know how Persian kings looks. We know them from Persian art. You don't have to guess at this. We don't have to make stuff up. The Greeks didn't have a separate invented way of what a Persian king looked like. They knew what the Persian king looked like because they'd seen it,
I don't know if this, if you consider it canon or not, but in the sequel also kind of underwrites that because the sequel effectively confirms everything that the narrator said. Like Xerxes is in that basically exactly the same way, and they explain how he became gold and 10 feet tall. Mm-hmm. But that's not an endorsement to watch the sequel.
Because Darius dies at Marathon, and then Xerxes, who is also there, swears revenge. Right? That's the introduction.
Yeah, and it's, if you think about like oral storytelling, if you're going back to Homer, it's like the descriptions of actual fighting, like the Iliad and the Trojan War, differs greatly than like the Odyssey, and like, oh, we're going to go to foreign lands and foreign people and come across some really strange things. And it's like a weird mashup of the two. Mm-hmm. But it's like, I don't think that's necessarily what the Greeks would have envisioned in the scenario of fighting, like, because they don't do that with Troy, right?
Well, there's two different stories that survive of Thermopylae. There's the one that is presumably the Spartan story, which you get in Diodorus and Plutarch, in which they hog the front line. They're always there fighting, and they actually go and like try and assassinate Xerxes, and they actually sort of wander off into the camp.
You have
and
pithy one-liners and like great little comebacks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they just fight for 3 days straight, and nobody else gets a word in, and it's all Spartans all the time, and they're amazing. And then there's Herodotus' version, which is much more critical, but it's still really invested in the idea that the Spartans are amazing. And so he's telling the story as best he could as a historical account in which the Spartans are performing in a sort of almost superhuman capacity as these perfect heroes of the Greeks. And so, both of those stories are presumably perfectly acceptable to the Spartans, but they don't have fantastical elements precisely because this supposedly, we are meant to believe that this really happened. Right? Mm-hmm. We are meant to believe this is a real story in which the Spartans showed themselves to be the best of the Greeks in a very Achillean way. Especially when they fight over the body of Leonidas, like this is very much what they're trying to portray, right?
Descended from Heracles, yeah.
Right? Yeah. They even mention that in the movie.
Yeah.
Which is cool. But like that sort of thing, it's just like, there are some cool tales that Herodotus attaches to them. One of them being, the Anachronisms saying like, we'll fight in the shade. Nope. These kind of little bits that he's just like, this is also noteworthy. But historians from him onward are very conscious of the fact that some of the things they write down are really for flavor and they're not really noteworthy. Xenophon has a couple of these passages where he basically says, I know this isn't really proper, but I wanted to include it anyway. It's very cute. Herodotus also does this. And so he clearly wants to sort of do everything he can to make this as incredible, as fantastic as possible. And still, it's grounded in reality because he doesn't want you to lose faith in the idea that this happened. This is a real story with real people in it. So yeah, it really irks me that people try to make excuses for what 300 does to that story.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think I have kind of like a final big question. And this is coming kind of from our Spartacus discussion as well, but like for all of the wrong that 300 does, like is it still at all useful for us to talk about it? Is it useful for us to maybe like teach with it, to say like these are where everything does go wrong? And like point these things out, or should we try to like lock it in a closet and forget about it?
Should we still be discussing this movie almost 20 years after its release?
Right?
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. If Gen Z and Gen Alpha doesn't know about it, should we be telling them about it?
Yes, that.
Yeah.
The forbidden room where 300 lives.
Yes.
No, I actually don't. I don't know. Like I spent like 5 hours of my day talking about this movie, about all the things that I think are wrong and objectionable about it in various, in all sorts of layers. It has so many things that you can say, can criticize, or you can, and there are a few things to praise as well. I mean, I hope we've done that. There are some really cool things about it, some really exciting things about it, but in the end, like I'm really tired of having to meet people where they are, which is they've seen 300, they find that exciting, they find that interesting, they want to know more about it, and to walk them back from it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One thing I always like about 300 is because everybody can see that it's not real, they kind of go into that discussion knowing like, oh, okay, I understand that I've been told a fable, like this is obviously not what really happened, but like what did happen. But the problem is that honestly, even people who are aware of that distinction, who know they haven't been watching historical documents, they still absorb that in some way and still make it part of their frame of reference that there is something fundamentally true about that. If you Google Spartan hoplite now, the iconography is overwhelmingly 300, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is just how we visualize them now. And so many people think that there is something realistic in the way they fight, or in the way they train, or in their description of their society. They know they're not learning history, but they are learning history, right? They can't help themselves. And I say they as if I'm not guilty of the same thing when I'm watching a movie about any period that I'm not, myself an expert in. We are conditioned to think that this is information, even when we know it isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm increasingly inclined to say, like, no, they shouldn't. They shouldn't learn the story this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I think that's goes back to like our experience of watching the movie itself, like when it first came out, and I'm like just being a little ignorant of everything and just getting to purely enjoy it for what it was, versus now when I do watch a lot of these movies again, because I've learned so much, it's exhausting sometimes to be like, nope, need to check the ancient source on that one.
That's always been sort of the defense, or like even Zack Snyder, like when questioned about the movie, his response is usually something along the lines of, at least in interviews that I read, well, it's like, it's clearly not meant to be taken literally or seriously, but at some level it does seep into people's ideas or imaginings brains, sometimes in very big, obvious ways, like I'm going to go put on my Spartan bikini and storm the Capitol, but also in just these sort of more subtle ways of the way it just kind of like sneaks into culture, and then it just becomes the way everybody thinks about history or war or valor or duty or whatever it is, right? And then so it has, that's the part that kind of gives me pause for thought. And maybe, it's more kind of being like, maybe it can be.
I mean, because you don't have to go too far off the beaten path on the internet to find these accounts that are kind of valorizing all sorts of like quite dodgy ideas about the past. But then their image of an inspiring Greek, somebody they aspire to, somebody whose achievements they look up to, it's going to be Leonidas, but it's going to be Leonidas from 300, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is the one they know, and that is the one they admire, and that is what they look up to. So even when you're looking away from the historical information that sort of trickles into, as you said, like into the zeitgeist, zeitgeist and into the sort of general understanding, even, against our will. You also just have this idea of like people are being sold on the idea that there is something admirable about what the Spartans did here, and specifically the way that this movie portrays that achievement, right? And so, the achievement of losing. There's something insidious to that I think is actually a problem. On the other hand, it's just, it's one of the ways in which we've told this story, and we're going to keep on doing that, right? Like, just like with all the other stories about Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and everybody else, nobody is really minding that who did the Napoleon movie?
Ridley Scott.
Ridley Scott, that's the one. That he made a really terrible Napoleon movie because honestly, like, we've done it before, we'll do it again. It's not going to ruin Napoleon, It's
And I will say, like, the one thing that has always been important about the media for me, as we've been covering Rome on TV, it's like I can't tell you the number of times I've looked at the Julio-Claudian family tree as like how you view family trees, and then watching I, Claudius, and like, oh, that's who this is, and like having what feels like more of a personal understanding of who these people were, even if it's not accurate based on what we know historically, it still leaves such a stronger impression.
It puts a face to a name.
Yeah.
That's a risk because of what they did with.
Oh yes,
people should know, right, that Leonidas was 33 years older than Gorgo, who was his niece, and they were married.
And he was never even supposed to be king, at least not originally.
No, exactly.
He makes fun of the E-Force for being inbred.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Like, weren't all of you technically? Like,
physician, heal thyself.
Ugh. So let's maybe bury 300 back in the ground.
Yeah, the memes might live on, but maybe the film shouldn't. So,
yeah. I mean, I don't think it will. To be honest, like, I think if you showed like Gen Z, if you showed them this movie. Sorry, I think Gen Z is the convention, actually.
No.
Say it your way.
It was fun hearing Zed. I'm like, oh, I like that. Yeah, Gen Z.
I don't think
that sounds like some kind of alien invasion. But anyway, like if you showed them this movie, I think they'd just be really put off by it, or at least a lot of them would be.
Yeah, I think they should be. Yeah.
Because it's just not. It's the ideology is not of this time. I think I would
truly.
Say.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of people on the internet disagree with me on that.
Love that for us.
Yeah, man.
So I think that seems to be our sign, right? Is everybody we're good? Yeah. All right. In that case, before we sign off, Roel, we wanted to thank you again for coming on. It's been lovely having you. Really enjoyed. We hope we didn't add too much weight onto the load of talking about 300. He made a face. Before we sign off, if there's anywhere where listeners can see, read, hear more from you, where can they find you?
Yeah, so whenever I do anything like this, I always post about it on Twitter whenever there's a link to share. So you can find me there. It's at Roel Konijnendijk, but like basically just my name, which you won't remember and won't be able to type. Find somewhere to copy paste my name, and then you can.
We'll be in the show notes, so we can put it there.
And the other thing is, I mean, I'm active on Reddit. I'm on Ask Historians. I'm one of the moderators. That's a community where you can come and ask us, historians questions, and then we'll try to give you an in-depth answer. So please do that if there's anything that you heard today or in any other episode of this show that made you go like, oh, I would like to know more about that, because we are here to help.
It's a subreddit I frequent myself. So
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Love to hear that.
Excellent. Again, thank you so much. Listeners, as always, you can find our episodes on movieswedig.com as well as on any major streaming services. Follow us on social media on variations of @DigMovies. And we will be back. What's next on our schedule, actually?
Troy.
All right. And we will be back revisiting more classics or old ones from the vault. We will be back to talk about Troy in our next episode. Thank you again, Roel, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.